The rain tapped gently against the window pane, a rhythmic patter that seemed to echo the restless cadence of my thoughts. I sat at the small desk in my apartment, staring blankly at the laptop screen as emails piled up unanswered. It wasn't writer's block, it was life's block. Or maybe it was just me, stuck somewhere between who I wanted to be and who I was letting myself become. The clock ticked past noon, but time felt irrelevant here, where days blurred into nights without much distinction, that I lived alone in this modest one-bedroom on the second floor of an old brick building, tucked away in a quiet neighborhood lined with towering oak trees. My neighbor across the hall had moved in months ago, a married man named Marcus, and though we'd exchanged polite nods and occasional small talk about parking spots or shared laundry schedules, there wasn't much more to our interactions than surface-level civility. At least, not until recently. Marcus was different from anyone else I'd ever met. He carried himself with an easy confidence that didn't feel forced or performative, like he knew exactly who he was even when the world around him tried to dictate otherwise. His voice, deep and resonant, could command attention without raising its volume, and his laugh, when I'd heard it once during a brief conversation about weekend plans, had a warmth that lingered long after the words faded. But what struck me most about him were his eyes, dark pools of mystery that hinted at stories untold, secrets kept close to his chest. There was something guarded yet inviting about them, as if they held both pain and possibility. Our first real interaction came unexpectedly late one evening when I returned home from work to find Marcus standing outside his door, fumbling with a set of keys. He looked up as I approached, offering a sheepish smile. "Hey," he said, his tone casual but tinged with something else. Nervousness? Vulnerability? Whatever it was, it caught me off guard. We ended up talking longer than usual that night, sharing fragments of ourselves through halting sentences and awkward pauses. By the end of it, I realized how little I actually knew about him and how desperately I wanted to know more. But there was tension, too, simmering beneath the surface of every glance and word exchanged. Marcus was married, though his wedding ring rarely made an appearance on his finger. Rumors swirled quietly among other neighbors, whispers about strained relationships and unspoken truths. Yet none of that mattered when I found myself stealing glances at him whenever our paths crossed, feeling my pulse quicken each time his gaze met mine. There was no denying the pull between us, magnetic and undeniable, drawing me closer despite all logic screaming for me to step back. And so began the dance, a delicate balancing act of proximity and distance, desire and restraint. Every encounter left me craving more while simultaneously dreading the consequences of wanting what I couldn't have. The line between friendship and something deeper grew thinner with each passing day, until it felt like a single misstep could send everything crashing down. Still, I couldn't stop myself from leaning in, inch by cautious inch, toward the flame that threatened to burn us both. That it wasn't just attraction, it was connection. A spark ignited by shared silences and stolen moments, fueled by the unspoken understanding that neither of us fit neatly into the role society had carved out for us. And though I told myself over and over again that nothing would, or should, come of it, the truth whispered louder than any rational argument. I was falling for him, hard and fast, in ways I never thought possible. The weight of it pressed heavily on my chest, a mixture of exhilaration and dread that followed me everywhere. What started as curiosity had blossomed into something far more dangerous. Longing. Longing for someone I shouldn't want, someone whose presence alone stirred emotions I'd buried long ago. Each moment spent near him felt electric, charged with potential, yet shadowed by the knowledge that pursuing this path would only lead to heartache. For him, for me, for everyone involved. But how do you walk away from something before it even begins? How do you silence the part of your soul that yearns for connection, for love, even if it comes wrapped in complications? These questions haunted me, swirling endlessly in my mind like storm clouds refusing to break. All I knew for certain was that Marcus had awakened something within me, something raw and beautiful and terrifying. And now there was no turning back. The story continues to unfold, weaving together threads of intimacy, conflict, and self-discovery. But for now, the foundation is laid. The end, for this section at least. It happened on a Tuesday of all days, a day so ordinary it almost felt like a betrayal when everything changed. I've been heading out to grab coffee from the little cafe down the block, my usual mid-afternoon ritual to break up the monotony of work. The air was crisp with a faint bite of autumn, leaves crunching underfoot as I walked. That's when I saw him, Marcus, standing at the corner, looking completely out of place in his tailored suit and polished shoes, staring intently at something on his phone. He didn't notice me at first, too absorbed in whatever crisis seemed to be unfolding on his screen. His brow furrowed slightly, lips pressed into a thin line, and for a moment, he looked impossibly human. Not the composed neighbor who always greeted me with a polite nod, but someone raw and real, caught off guard by life's unpredictability. Then, just as quickly, the mask slipped back into place. He glanced up, spotted me, and offered a small, strained smile. "Hey," he said, his voice tinged with exhaustion. "Fancy running into you here." I hesitated, unsure whether to keep walking or stop. Something about the way he stood there, shoulders tense and posture rigid, made me pause. "Everything okay?" I asked, already regretting the question. It was invasive, maybe even presumptuous, but it slipped out before I could stop it. His laugh was sharp and humorless. "Just dealing with some stuff." He shoved his phone into his pocket, avoiding my gaze. For a second, I thought he might walk away, leaving the conversation unfinished. Instead, he sighed and ran a hand over his face, the gesture achingly vulnerable. "Sorry. Bad day." The words hung between us, heavy with unspoken weight. I wanted to ask what was wrong, to pry open the cracks in his armor and see what lay beneath. But I didn't. Instead, I nodded toward the cafe. "Coffee helps, right? Want to grab one?" He hesitated, glancing at his watch, then shook his head. "I shouldn't. Work calls. It'll only take 5 minutes." I pressed, surprising myself with the insistence in my tone. Maybe it was the way he looked, so tired, so defeated, that made me want to offer him an escape, however brief. Or maybe it was selfishness, a desire to hold on to this unexpected moment of closeness for just a little longer. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he relented. "Okay, 5 minutes." We stepped inside the cafe together, the warmth of the space enveloping us like a cocoon. The barista greeted us with a cheerful smile, oblivious to the tension crackling between Marcus and me. As we waited in line, I noticed the way his fingers drummed lightly against the counter, betraying his anxiety. When it was our turn to order, he fumbled with his wallet, dropping a few coins onto the floor. Without thinking, I bent down to help him pick them up, our hands brushing briefly as we reached for the same quarter. "Thanks," he murmured, his cheeks flushing ever so slightly. "No problem," I replied, my own pulse quickening inexplicably. By the time we had our drinks and found a quiet corner to sit, the awkwardness had begun to ease. We talked, haltingly at first, then more freely, as if the act of sharing caffeine somehow loosened the knots binding us both. He told me about his job, his frustrations with deadlines and demanding clients, though he never mentioned his wife or home life. In return, I shared snippets of my own struggles. The loneliness of freelancing, the constant battle to stay motivated when no one else was watching. But it wasn't the words themselves that mattered. It was the silences in between, those moments when neither of us spoke, yet the air buzzed with unspoken understanding. There were questions I wanted to ask, about the shadows lingering in his eyes, about the wedding ring conspicuously absent from his finger. But I held back, afraid of overstepping boundaries I wasn't sure existed. As the minutes ticked by, I became acutely aware of how close we were sitting, knees nearly touching beneath the table. Every movement felt amplified. The way he sipped his coffee, the subtle shift of his body as he leaned forward to make a point, the occasional flicker of his gaze meeting mine before darting away again. My heart raced, though I tried to convince myself it was nothing more than nerves. After all, this was just coffee. Just two neighbors sharing a casual chat. Except it didn't feel casual. Not anymore. When the conversation inevitably wound down, Marcus checked his watch and stood reluctantly. "I should go," he said, though his tone suggested reluctance rather than urgency. "Thanks for the coffee and the distraction." "Anytime," I replied, forcing a smile despite the knot tightening in my stomach. As he turned to leave, he paused, looking back at me with an expression I couldn't quite decipher. "You're good at listening," he added softly. "Not everyone is." And then he was gone, disappearing through the door and into the bustling street outside. I sat there for a long time afterward, clutching my now-cold cup of coffee, replaying every word and glance in my mind. What had started as a simple act of kindness had transformed into something far more complicated, a connection that refused to be ignored. Back at home, I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted. The encounter lingered in my thoughts, coloring everything else with its intensity. Why had he opened up to me, even just a little? Was it loneliness? Desperation? Or was there something else lurking beneath the surface, something neither of us dared to name? That night, sleep eluded me. I tossed and turned, haunted by the image of Marcus standing at the cafe counter, looking so lost and yet so achingly beautiful. My mind raced with possibilities, each one more dangerous than the last. What would happen if I let myself get closer to him? If I allowed myself to explore the pull I felt, the magnetic force drawing me inexorably toward him? But alongside the longing came fear, a deep, gnawing fear of rejection, of judgment, of ruining the fragile balance we'd only just begun to build. Society's rules loomed large in my mind, whispering warnings about consequences and collateral damage. This wasn't just about me. It was about him, about his marriage, about the lives intertwined with ours in ways I couldn't fully comprehend. Still, the memory of his smile, the genuine one that broke through his guarded exterior, kept replaying in my mind. It was a reminder that people weren't always what they seemed, that beneath the polished surfaces and carefully constructed facades lay layers of complexity waiting to be uncovered. And perhaps, just perhaps, I wasn't the only one yearning for something more. The next morning, I woke with a sense of resolve tempered by uncertainty. Whatever this was, this strange, intoxicating dance between us, it wasn't going to resolve itself anytime soon. All I knew for sure was that I couldn't ignore it, no matter how much easier that might have been. The end, for now. The days that followed our impromptu coffee date were a blur of anticipation and restraint. I found myself hyper-aware of every sound outside my door, the creak of footsteps, the jingle of keys, hoping it might be Marcus. But he didn't come knocking, and neither did I. Instead, we exchanged polite smiles in passing, as though nothing had changed. Yet everything had. It wasn't until Friday evening that our paths crossed again. This time, it was entirely unplanned. I was returning from the grocery store, arms laden with bags, when I nearly collided with him on the staircase. He reached out instinctively to steady me, his hand brushing against mine for just a fraction of a second before pulling away. The contact sent a jolt through me, electric and fleeting, leaving my skin tingling long after he'd stepped back. "Careful," he said, his voice low and amused. "Wouldn't want you dropping all those groceries." "Thanks," I replied, trying to mask the flutter in my chest with a casual grin. "I think I've got it under control now." He lingered there for a moment, watching me struggle to balance the bags while fishing for my keys. Finally, he sighed and held out a hand. "Let me help." Before I could protest, he took two of the heavier bags from me, effortlessly carrying them up the last few steps to my apartment. His presence filled the narrow hallway, overwhelming in its familiarity, yet intoxicatingly foreign. As I unlocked the door, I felt the weight of his gaze on me, curious and probing, as if he were seeing me for the first time. Inside, I set the remaining bags on the counter and turned to face him. "You didn't have to do that. It's no big deal," he said, shrugging off the thanks with a dismissive wave. But his eyes betrayed him. They lingered too long, searching for something I wasn't sure I could give. We stood there awkwardly for a beat, the silence stretching thin between us. Then, almost reflexively, I gestured toward the couch. "Do you want to stay for a minute? Catch your breath." His hesitation was barely perceptible, but it was there, a flicker of doubt crossing his features before he nodded. Sure, just for a minute. As he settled onto the couch, I busied myself unpacking the groceries, using the task as an excuse to avoid looking directly at him. Still, I could feel him watching me, his presence radiating warmth even from across the room. When I finally turned around, he was leaning forward, elbows resting on his knees, his expression thoughtful. So, he began, breaking the quiet. What's your story? The question caught me off guard. My story? Yeah. He tilted his head slightly, studying me with that same intensity that made my pulse quicken. You're always working, always writing or typing or whatever it is you do. What drives you? What keeps you going? I laughed nervously, unsure how to answer. That's a loaded question. Humor me. For a moment, I considered deflecting, offering some vague response about deadlines and ambition. But something in his tone, genuine curiosity mixed with a hint of vulnerability, made me pause. Slowly, I sank into the armchair opposite him, meeting his gaze head on. I guess I write because it's the one thing I'm good at. Or at least, it's the one thing that makes sense most of the time. Life gets messy, people get complicated, but words, they stay put. They don't change unless you let them. He nodded slowly, absorbing my words. That's beautiful, actually, and honest. What about you? I countered, emboldened by his openness. What drives you? His smile faltered, replaced by a shadow of sadness. Honestly, I don't know anymore. Used to think I had it all figured out. Career, family, the whole 9 yards. But lately, he trailed off, shaking his head. Lately, it feels like I'm just going through the motions. The admission hung heavy in the air, raw and unfiltered. I wanted to reach out, to say something comforting, but the words stuck in my throat. Instead, I leaned forward, mirroring his posture. Do you ever wish you could start over? Leave everything behind and just begin again? His laugh was soft, almost wistful. Every damn day. We sat there for a while longer, talking about everything and nothing. Movies we loved, places we'd traveled, dreams we'd abandoned along the way. Each shared detail brought us closer, weaving threads of connection that felt impossible to unravel. By the time he left, promising to return another day, I realized I hadn't thought about work or anything else once during our conversation. Over the next few weeks, these moments became more frequent. Sometimes it was a quick chat in the hallway. Other times it was hours spent sitting on my couch, debating music playlists or laughing over bad TV shows. With each encounter, the walls between us grew thinner until it felt like there was nothing left to hide behind point one rainy afternoon. Marcus showed up at my door drenched to the bone, having forgotten his umbrella during a sudden downpour. He looked ridiculous standing there, water dripping from his hair and soaking in his shirt, but also disarmingly endearing. Without thinking, I grabbed a towel and ushered him inside. You look like a drowned rat, I teased, handing him the towel. Gee, thanks, he shot back, though his grin softened the sarcasm. As he dried himself off, I couldn't help but notice the way his wet clothes clung to his frame, outlining muscles I'd only imagined before. My cheeks flushed, and I quickly turned away, pretending to busy myself with making tea. When I handed him a steaming mug, he accepted it gratefully, cradling it in both hands. You're really good at this hospitality thing, he said, his tone teasing but warm. Maybe I should forget my umbrella more often. Don't push your luck, I replied, though my smile betrayed my amusement. As the rain continued to patter against the windows, we settled into a comfortable rhythm, discussing books and childhood memories. At one point, he leaned back against the couch, letting out a contented sigh. This is nice, he murmured. Feels safe. The word struck a chord deep within me. Safe. Was that what this was? A sanctuary from the chaos outside, a place where we could shed our masks and simply exist? Later that evening, as he prepared to leave, he hesitated by the door, turning to face me with an unreadable expression. Thank you, he said softly. For today. For everything. Anytime, I replied, meaning it more than I cared to admit. But not every moment was easy. There were nights when guilt gnawed at me, whispering cruel reminders of the boundaries I was crossing. Who was I to insert myself into his life? knowing full well the complications it entailed. And yet, whenever I resolved to distance myself, fate, or perhaps sheer stubbornness, pulled us back together. One such night, we found ourselves walking along the riverbank, the city lights reflecting off the water in shimmering ripples. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and distant rain. We walked side by side, close enough that our shoulders occasionally brushed, sending shivers down my spine. "You ever feel like you're living someone else's life?" Marcus asked suddenly, breaking the peaceful silence. "All the time," I admitted. "Like you're playing a role you didn't audition for." He chuckled darkly. "Exactly. Like no matter what you do, you can't escape the script." We stopped at a bench overlooking the water, sitting in companionable silence as the world moved around us. After a while, he spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sometimes I wonder what it would be like to rewrite it, to choose a different ending." I glanced at him, heart pounding in my chest. "And what would that ending look like?" He didn't answer immediately, instead staring out at the horizon as if searching for the words. When he finally turned to face me, his eyes were filled with a mixture of longing and fear. "I don't know yet, but maybe it starts with being honest. About who I am, about what I want." The confession hung between us, fragile and trembling, like a thread waiting to snap. I wanted to tell him I understood, that I felt the same pull toward authenticity, toward freedom. But the words caught in my throat, tangled up in the web of uncertainty and self-doubt. Instead, I reached out, placing a tentative hand on his knee. It was a small gesture, barely noticeable, but it carried the weight of everything unsaid. He covered my hand with his own, squeezing gently, and for a moment, the world seemed to stand still. When we parted ways that night, neither of us spoke of what had passed between us. But as I lay in bed later, replaying the scene in my mind, I knew one thing for certain. Whatever this was, it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The storm rolled in without warning, a sudden tempest that turned the evening sky an ominous shade of charcoal. I had been sitting at my desk, staring blankly at the blinking cursor on my laptop screen, when the first crack of thunder rattled the windows. It was one of those storms that felt alive, electric and unpredictable, as if nature itself were conspiring to shake loose something buried deep within me. Marcus arrived moments later, knocking urgently on my door. When I opened it, he looked wild-eyed and disheveled, his hair damp from the rain and his shirt clinging to him like a second skin. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there trembling, not from cold, but from something far more visceral. "Are you okay?" I asked, stepping aside to let him in. He hesitated before crossing the threshold, shaking his head slightly, as if trying to clear it. "No," he admitted, his voice barely audible over the sound of the storm outside. "I'm not." Something about the way he said it, the raw honesty in his tone, made my chest tighten. I closed the door behind him and turned to face him, watching as he paced the small living room like a caged animal. His movements were erratic, restless, betraying the turmoil brewing beneath the surface. "What happened?" I pressed gently, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. For a long moment, he didn't respond. Then, with a heavy sigh, he sank onto the couch, burying his face in his hands. "Everything's falling apart," he muttered, his words muffled but unmistakably anguished. "My marriage, it's over. Has been for years, really. But tonight," he trailed off, shaking his head again. "Tonight, she told me she knows. About everything." My breath caught in my throat. The weight of his confession settled over us like a suffocating blanket, filling the space between us with unspoken implications. Everything. Did that mean? Before I could process the thought fully, Marcus looked up at me, his dark eyes searching mine with an intensity that left no room for doubt. "She knows about you," he whispered, his voice breaking on the last word. The room seemed to tilt, the ground shifting beneath my feet. My mind raced, grappling with the enormity of what he'd just revealed. "Me?" I managed to choke out, though the question sounded absurd even to my own ears. "Yes." He stood abruptly, closing the distance between us until we were mere inches apart. His presence was overwhelming, consuming every ounce of air in the room. She knows how much I think about you, how much I want you, how impossible it is for me to stop. His words hit me like a tidal wave, crashing over me with such force that I staggered backward, bracing myself against the wall. This couldn't be happening. Not now, not like this. And yet, here we were, standing on the precipice of something neither of us could undo. I shouldn't have come here, Marcus continued, his voice strained with self-loathing. I shouldn't have let this go this far. But I can't. I can't stay away from you anymore. His admission hung in the air, heavy and electric, charged with all the longing and fear and desperation we'd both been carrying silently for weeks. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure he could hear it, each beat reverberating through my body like a drum roll, leading up to some inevitable crescendo. Marcus, I began, but my voice faltered, unable to find the right words. What could I possibly say? That I felt the same way? That I'd spent countless sleepless nights wrestling with these exact same emotions? Or should I tell him to leave, to walk away before things spiraled further out of control? But before I could decide, he reached out, cupping my face in his hands with a tenderness that made my knees weak. His touch was feather-light, hesitant yet deliberate, as if he were afraid I might disappear if he pressed too hard. For a moment, we simply stared at each other, our breaths mingling in the narrow space between us. Then, without warning, he kissed me. It wasn't gentle or tentative. It was fierce and desperate, born of months of pent-up desire and unspoken truths. His lips moved against mine with an urgency that left me breathless, his fingers threading through my hair as he pulled me closer. Every nerve in my body ignited, sparks shooting down my spine as I surrendered to the sensation, wrapping my arms around him and holding on for dear life. When we finally broke apart, gasping for air, the silence that followed was deafening. We stood there, foreheads pressed together, hearts racing in sync, neither of us daring to speak. The storm outside raged on, lightning illuminating the room in brief flashes, but it felt distant now, like the world had shrunk to just the two of us. I'm sorry, Marcus whispered eventually, his voice thick with emotion. I shouldn't have done that. Don't apologize, I replied quickly, surprising even myself with the conviction in my tone. Please don't. He searched my eyes, looking for reassurance or maybe permission, and whatever he found there seemed to ease some of the tension in his shoulders. Slowly, he nodded, pulling me into a tight embrace. I rested my head against his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, we weren't completely lost. Later, when the storm had passed and the city lights flickered back to life outside my window, we sat together on the couch, wrapped in a shared blanket. Neither of us spoke for a long time, content to simply exist in the aftermath of what had transpired. Eventually, Marcus broke the silence. This changes everything, he said softly, his gaze fixed on the floor. For both of us. I know, I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. But maybe that's not a bad thing. He glanced at me then, his expression unreadable. Do you really believe that? I hesitated, weighing the truth of my own words. Did I believe it? Could this fragile connection we'd built withstand the chaos waiting for us on the other side of this night? There were no guarantees, no promises we could make to each other beyond the present moment. But as I looked at him, really looked at him, I realized that sometimes uncertainty was enough. Sometimes the risk was worth it. I said finally, reaching for his hand and intertwining our fingers. We'll figure it out. Together. His smile was faint but genuine, a glimmer of hope cutting through the shadows that had haunted him for so long. And in that moment, despite everything looming ahead, I believed it too. The morning after the storm arrived with a deceptive calm, sunlight streaming through my window as if nothing had changed. But everything had. The weight of what had happened pressed down on me like a leaden blanket, making it hard to breathe, let alone move. I lay in bed for what felt like hours, replaying the night over and over in my mind. The kiss, the confession, the fragile promise we'd made to face whatever came next together. When I finally dragged myself out of bed, the apartment felt different, charged with an energy that wasn't entirely mine. Every object seemed to carry the echo of Marcus's presence. The couch where we'd sat wrapped in silence, the towel he'd used to dry off, the faint scent of his cologne lingering in the air. It was comforting and suffocating all at once, a reminder of how deeply entangled our lives had become that I texted him before I could second-guess myself. "Are you okay?" His response came quickly, though it lacked his usual confidence. "Not really, but I'll survive." That single line sent a pang through my chest. Survive. Not thrive, not hope, just survive. It was a stark reminder of the stakes we were dealing with, the precarious tightrope we were walking. And yet, there was no turning back now. Whatever this was between us, it had taken root too deeply to be ignored. By midday, reality began to creep in. My phone buzzed incessantly with notifications from work emails and social media updates. But none of it mattered compared to the one message I dreaded receiving. News of what Marcus's wife knew, or worse, what she planned to do about it. I tried to distract myself by diving into freelance projects, typing furiously to drown out the gnawing anxiety in my gut. But every time I glanced at the clock, another hour had passed without hearing from him. Finally, around 3 o'clock, there was a soft knock at my door. My heart leapt into my throat as I opened it to find Marcus standing there, looking even more worn than he had the night before. His eyes were bloodshot, his shoulders slumped under the weight of whatever confrontation he'd endured. "She wants a divorce," he said flatly, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "She says she's known for months, maybe longer. She didn't say anything until last night because, well, she wanted to see if I'd stop." "Stop what?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Seeing you." He sank onto the couch, running a hand through his hair. "She said she couldn't compete with someone who makes me happy. Someone who understands me in ways she never could." His words should have brought relief, validation even. Instead, they filled me with guilt, a sharp, twisting ache that settled deep in my stomach. This wasn't just about us. It was about her, about the life they'd built together, however fractured it might have been. I hated the thought of being the catalyst for its destruction. "What happens now?" I asked quietly, sitting beside him but careful not to touch. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "She's giving me space to figure things out, but God, it's such a mess. The kids." He stopped abruptly, swallowing hard. For the first time since we'd met, I saw tears glistening in his eyes. They're confused, scared. They don't understand why mommy and daddy aren't talking anymore. And I hate that I'm the reason for that. The vulnerability in his voice broke something inside me. Without thinking, I reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. "You're not the only reason," I said firmly. "Relationships fall apart for a lot of reasons, Marcus. You can't take all the blame." "But I can't ignore my part in it either," he countered, pulling his hand away. "This isn't fair to anyone. Not to her, not to them, not to you." His rejection of my comfort stung, but I understood it. He was wrestling with demons far bigger than either of us, and I couldn't shield him from the consequences of his choices. All I could do was stand by him, even when it hurt. Over the next few days, the fallout rippled outward, touching every corner of our lives. Neighbors whispered behind closed doors, their curiosity piqued by the sudden tension emanating from Marcus's apartment. At first, I tried to brush it off, telling myself that gossip was inevitable in a place like ours. But when I started noticing sideways glances and hushed conversations whenever I passed by, the weight of judgment became impossible to ignore. IT work. Things weren't much better. A colleague casually mentioned hearing rumors about some drama involving one of the tenants in my building. Her tone was light, almost teasing, but the implication was clear. People were watching, speculating, judging. I forced a laugh and changed the subject, but the encounter left me rattled. How long would it take for the truth, or at least fragments of it, to spread beyond our little bubble? And then there was Marcus himself, caught in the eye of the storm. He alternated between moments of clarity and despair, sometimes calling me late at night to talk through his fears, other times retreating into silence for days on end. Each withdrawal felt like a knife twisting in my chest, reminding me of how powerless I was to fix any of this point one evening. After a particularly difficult day, I decided to visit him unannounced. When he opened the door, his expression softened instantly, relief washing over his features. "I was going to call you," he said, stepping aside to let me in. "You don't have to explain," I replied, brushing past him. "I just wanted to check on you." We ended up sitting on his couch, surrounded by unpacked boxes and half-empty shelves, a physical manifestation of the chaos unraveling around us. For a while, neither of us spoke, content to listen to the hum of the city outside. Then, finally, Marcus broke the silence. "I feel like I'm losing myself," he confessed, his voice barely above a whisper. "Like I'm being pulled in so many directions that I don't even know who I am anymore." I turned to look at him, my heart breaking at the pain etched into his face. "You're still you," I said softly. "Just a version of yourself you haven't fully embraced yet." He laughed bitterly. "And what if embracing that version cost me everything?" "It might," I admitted, refusing to sugarcoat the truth. "But holding back isn't saving you either. Look at where that's gotten you." For a long moment, he stared at me, searching for answers I couldn't provide. Then slowly he nodded. "You're right. I know you are. But knowing and doing are two very different things." As the weeks dragged on, the uncertainty grew unbearable. Marcus filed for separation, a decision that sparked a flurry of legal battles and custody negotiations. His wife, once a distant figure in this tangled web, became a looming presence, her anger manifesting in terse emails and heated arguments conducted through lawyers. Through it all, Marcus clung to the idea that he owed her and their children a measure of respect, even as the foundation of their marriage crumbled beneath them. Meanwhile, our relationship remained suspended in limbo, neither advancing nor retreating. We spent stolen moments together when we could, finding solace in each other's arms during quiet nights or brief walks through empty streets. But the shadow of his family loomed large, casting doubt over whether we'd ever truly be free to build something new. One night, as we lay side by side in my bed, Marcus turned to me with a question that caught me off guard. "Do you think we'll make it through this?" I hesitated, unsure how to answer. The truth was I didn't know. Love alone wasn't enough to shield us from the storms raging around us. But giving up wasn't an option either, not when we come this far. "I think we have to," I said finally, meeting his gaze. "Because the alternative is letting fear win, and I refuse to let that happen." He smiled faintly, leaning in to kiss me. It was tender and fleeting, a promise wrapped in uncertainty. As he pulled away, I realized that some questions didn't need immediate answers. Some journeys required patience, faith, and a willingness to endure the unknown. Months passed, each day stretching longer than the last, yet somehow slipping through our fingers like sand in an hourglass. The chaos that had once consumed us began to settle, though not without scars. Marcus's separation became official, a legal document that marked the end of one chapter and the uncertain beginning of another. His children, caught in the crossfire of their parents' unraveling, slowly adjusted to weekends spent shuttling between two homes. It wasn't easy for any of them, but there were moments of light breaking through the cracks. For Marcus and me, those months were a delicate balancing act. We tiptoed around the wreckage of his past life, careful not to step on the fragile pieces still clinging to hope. There were days when guilt threatened to swallow him whole, when he questioned whether pursuing happiness was worth the cost. On those days, I held him, not with words, but with presence, reminding him that healing wasn't linear and that love didn't demand perfection. And then there were the good days. Days when laughter returned to his voice, when the weight on his shoulders lifted just enough for him to breathe freely again. Those were the moments I clung to, storing them away like treasures against the inevitable storms ahead. One crisp autumn morning, we found ourselves walking along the same riverbank where so much had changed between us. The leaves had turned fiery shades of orange and red, carpeting the ground in color. The air smelled of earth and wood smoke, carrying with it a sense of renewal despite the chill. We walked side by side, hands brushing occasionally but never quite holding on, a testament to how far we'd come, yet how cautious we still were. "I've been thinking," Marcus said suddenly, breaking the peaceful silence. "About what comes next." I glanced at him, curious but wary. "What do you mean?" He stopped walking, turning to face me with an intensity that made my pulse quicken. It can't stay in limbo forever. I need to decide who I want to be. Not just for me, but for you too." His words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. For so long, we'd existed in the gray areas, neither fully committing nor letting go. But now, standing here amidst the vibrant hues of fall, it felt like the universe was nudging us toward clarity. "I don't expect you to have all the answers," I replied carefully. "But I need to know if this is real. If we're real." Marcus reached out, taking my hand in his. His touch was steady, grounding, as if anchoring himself to something solid after months of drifting. "You are the realest thing in my life right now," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "The only thing that makes sense. And I'm tired of running from that." Tears pricked at the corners of my eyes, but I blinked them back, unwilling to let vulnerability overshadow the moment. "So what happens now?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. "Now," he said, squeezing my hand, "we start building. Together." It wasn't a grand declaration or a sweeping promise. It was simple, honest, and true. And in that simplicity lay its power. For the first time since we'd met, I allowed myself to believe that maybe we could survive this. That maybe love, no matter how complicated, could endure. In the weeks that followed, Marcus began to rebuild his life piece by piece. He moved into a small apartment closer to his kids' school, filling the space with memories both old and new. Photos of his children lined the walls alongside paintings he'd picked out with me during weekend trips to local art galleries. Each item told a story, not of loss, but of resilience, of finding beauty even in brokenness. As for me, I discovered a strength I hadn't known I possessed. Loving Marcus had forced me to confront parts of myself I'd long ignored. My fears, my insecurities, my capacity for patience and forgiveness. I learned that love wasn't about fixing someone or being fixed. It was about growing together, even when the path was rocky and uncertain. Our relationship wasn't perfect. There were still nights when doubt crept in, when the ghosts of his marriage lingered in the shadows. But we faced them head on, choosing honesty over avoidance, vulnerability over retreat. Slowly but surely, we carved out a future that felt authentic, one built on trust and mutual understanding. That on a quiet evening several months later, we stood together on the balcony of his new apartment, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. The wind carried the faint hum of traffic below, mingling with the soft strains of jazz playing inside. Marcus wrapped an arm around my waist, pulling me close as we leaned against the railing. "You know," he said, his tone thoughtful, "I used to think happiness was something you chased. Like if you worked hard enough, checked off enough boxes, you'd finally get there. And now," I prompted, tilting my head to look at him, "now I think happiness is something you create, with the people who matter most." He paused, smiling softly. "With you." His words filled me with a warmth that radiated from my chest to every corner of my being. In that moment, surrounded by the hum of life and the man I loved, I realized something profound. Happiness wasn't a destination. It was a choice. A daily decision to show up, to fight for what mattered, to embrace the messy, beautiful complexity of being human. As we stood there, bathed in the golden glow of the setting sun, I knew we weren't just surviving anymore. We were thriving, together.